Welcome to Beyond the B, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community.
I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy, and I'm joined by Bernard Gouw. Bernard is a social impact specialist and has spent the past 4.5 years at B Lab developing the human rights, fair work, and JEDI impact topics. He recently left B Lab and works as an independent consultant so that he can work more hands-on with companies. If listeners remember, Bernard was on for the Fair Work podcast topic we did last year, and we're glad to have you back. It's been a long gap in between when we had you last, Bernard.
It has indeed been a long gap, but I'm very happy to be here to join you on this podcast.
And so, Bernard, can you refresh listeners maybe a bit about your background, just so in case it's been a while, and how you got into this work?
Sure. So I've only ever worked in the social impact space. I have a background working across different stakeholder groups. So a little bit of civil society with Oxfam, a little bit of intergovernmental organizations with the United Nations, also a little bit of consultancy, but always working in the labor and human rights space. And so then it was also a natural fit to get that job working at B Lab, where I was responsible for the social standards. I was hired 4.5 years ago at that time so that B Lab could have in-house experts. And then I was hired as the social in-house expert to work on the new standards.
When you were first hired at B Lab, were they like, we want you to write the new standards? Was that explicitly part of the job?
Yeah, and there was a really funny moment in the beginning. So they basically expanded the team and had in-house experts, also an environmental expert, Brigitte, who I know has done one of the other podcast episodes. And in the early days, we really felt like, this won't take long. I remember there was even a question to Brigitte and me like, so do you think we can do this in 1 year? And Brigitte and I, we looked at each other like, yeah, that seems feasible. Now, as we now know, it took 4 years to actually do it. We were very ambitious in those early days, but of course, a lot of curveballs came our way, a lot of EU regulation, which mixed things up, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, and I imagine that EU regulation, but if you just sort of wrote the standards without having to do feedback processes or like interviews with the B Corp community, you probably could have done it a lot quicker, but you did so many consultations, right?
Absolutely. That was such an important part of the process, doing these public consultations. We did 2 public consultations. And it's pretty cool if you think about it, right? Literally anyone in the world could participate. And we did a lot of cool things, like we provided compensation for a lot of people from underrepresented groups to participate. So I look back on that period with a lot of pride. I think it was really also a privilege to work for an organization that was willing to commit all the resources, all the needed resources to do that work properly. So both time, but also money, having capacity in-house. It really was a privilege to be able to write standards in such an enabling environment.
Awesome. Well, today, for listeners, we're going to jump into the human rights topic. So just as a refresher, we've done government affairs and collective action with Grace Son. That was last year. We did fair work with Bernard last year, and we did environmental stewardship and circularity with Brigitte. And so this is the long overdue 4th installment of our B Corp standard series, the V2 standards. And so maybe we could just start with a framing. So what is human rights, and why was this topic chosen to be one of the things for the B Corp standards?
It's an interesting question, because I think most B Corps and most actors in our community would be like, human rights, great, let's have more of them. But actually, if we look at what's in the impact topic, it's a very specific approach to human rights. And it's embedded in international frameworks like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Now, V1.6, the previous standards, were not aligned with the so-called UNGPs. And we can talk about why that is. There's a good reason for that. But basically, there was at a point when you're updating the standards, you do really look externally and think, okay, what are we potentially missing? And I think this was a glaring gap. There were also stakeholders that wrote public pieces saying, hey, B Corp, you're not aligned to the UNGPs, get your act together. So it was actually a very obvious one to address from the very beginning of the process. Okay, we need to really beef up the standards on human rights. And then one thing that's really cool about the business and human rights space is there is very clear consensus on what good looks like. So in a lot of sustainability topics, right, you can have different views, different frameworks, but there is consensus on what it means to respect human rights, what a business needs to do essentially. And so it's actually pretty straightforward to say, okay, we want to tackle human rights. How do we do it? Well, then we look to the UNGPs and then we try to
and
distill that
UNGP means UN guiding principles.
UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Yeah. I mean, it's such a mouthful that you very quickly end up saying UNGPs. And I won't go into too much detail about the UNGPs because I can imagine for a lot of listeners, it's, maybe feels a bit distant, feels a bit academic, but it is an incredible document that has really created the paradigm that we're in. In short, what it says is all companies are responsible for respecting human rights. And that's actually a pretty powerful message, right? It sets the bar high, it sets clear expectations, it's global, it's for all companies. And so in that sense, it's a very powerful and useful framework.
And I think just for listeners as well, what Bernard and I will try to do is there's a lot of B Corps. I think 60% are small service-based companies as well. So we're going to also make sure that human rights doesn't get so theoretical. And a lot of companies don't have a deep manufacturing supply chain. And so we'll talk about that in this interview as well, as sort of what's the difference for a service company and a manufacturing or product company. And I wonder, just to bring in one of the things where human rights did stand out in the evolution of the standards is I remember one of the critiques of Nespresso getting certified was that in the 1.6 standards, someone had looked through the whole thing and said, oh, they don't have a public human rights policy, or there's something about the human rights gap. Was that part of the thinking of like, we need to really make sure this is tied up for B Lab?
Yeah, I mean, I would say generally speaking, we wouldn't really have looked at individual company cases and think, okay, that needs to be addressed. So we would never really look at, for example, Nespresso. We were obviously receptive to stakeholder feedback. And if there was a complaint, a legitimate complaint, or like I just alluded to, actually 2 people wrote articles saying we needed to improve our standards on human rights. So we were definitely receptive to that kind of feedback. I think a lot of the feedback I heard was less on the human rights policy, more on human rights violations in the supply chain. And I think it's fair to say that looking at the previous standards, this honestly, I already felt this from day one when I joined B Lab. I was like, okay, the standards have a lot of amazing content, but they could be stronger on the supply chain. And so from day one, that was already a big focus area. It's like, right, we need to beef up certain areas. Human rights is one of them. And generally speaking, we need to beef up what it means to have good supply chain practices, both on the social side as well as the environmental side. So that was a massive focus during the development.
Right. Well, maybe we could also look at, Bernard and I talked a little bit before starting, and there are some major themes that apply to every company for B Corps who are going to be responsible for this new human rights standard. And Bernard and I talked about, rather than looking at HR 2.1 or, HR 1. We can get lost in the numbers to maybe talk about these 4 major themes and then speak more broadly about how B Corps can think about doing them. And so maybe one framing thing, I think, for B Corps, Bernard, would it be fair to say when B Lab is talking about human rights, it's less of human rights as it relates to your own staff and employees in country? It's more of supply chain focus, right? Is that the main purpose of human rights topic?
So this is one of the most important things of the human rights work is wherever the issues might be. And so a starting point with the human rights impact topic is companies need to have the widest possible scope because they need to be mindful and be aware of where those biggest impacts are. Now, for some companies, that might be in the supply chain. So if there's a manufacturing company with a deep supply chain in faraway countries where they have less visibility, absolutely the supply chain becomes very important. But there could be a company, maybe there's a company that works with people with disabilities, right? And maybe they're a service company, so they don't have a traditional supply chain. Well, for them, human rights means looking very closely at the employees that they have, because that's where the risks are. And then similarly, there could be other companies that maybe they sell products that can be very dangerous. So social media, I think, is a great example of that. Social media doesn't really have a supply chain, or not a traditional one. So the human rights risks are more with the consumers, the clients. I guess, yeah, end consumers is the right way to put it. And so it really depends on company context. And that's what all this human rights work is about, is companies being self-reflective, being sincere, being honest, essentially judging themselves and being like, okay, where are my impacts most likely to appear?
Got it. And would you say, could you then distinguish for folks maybe between human rights broadly, fair work, and JEDI? Like, how would you see those being like, where are the delineations between those for B Corps?
Yeah, you know what? They could have easily all been one topic and been like the social standards, or they could have even theory all been under human rights. What we found, though, is they tend to be very distinct topics within companies and within standards and frameworks. So this is a gross generalization, but I think it helps make the point is generally people who work in JEDI or diversity and inclusion are less familiar with human rights standards, and people who work in the business and human rights space are less familiar with diversity and inclusion standards. And also in terms of expertise and experience, they tend to be very distinct. It wouldn't surprise me if in 10 years we merge the two, because I can see that they're converging. But for the time being, they are just treated very, very differently. And I think the best way to describe it to people is the human rights impact topic is all about human rights due diligence. And I think for a lot of people can feel very governance-y, right? It's all about how is the business set up to respect human rights. Whereas a lot of what's in Fair Work and JEDI, some of it is about policies and how the business is set up, but a lot of it is about outcomes as well, particularly in JEDI, right? So the diversity of the workforce or of senior leadership, or is your website accessible? It's an outcome. And that's less so the case with the human rights impact topic, which tends to be more focused on how the business is set up. So more in technical terms, more output based.
Got it. Well, maybe let's bring it to these 4 principles, because I think it will help folks make more sense of where they delineate or what's relevant to them. So we have this first principle, which is around committing publicly to respecting human rights. So that's a requirement for all B Corps. Second, identifying the salient human rights issues and developing a strategy. Third is prevent, mitigate, and remediate negative human rights impacts. And then fourth, working with suppliers to achieve human rights objectives. And so we're kind of paraphrasing some of the topics, but these are the general principles rather than saying HR 1.5, HR 2.1, blah, blah, blah. And so maybe let's start with this requirement to commit publicly to respecting human rights for B Corps. What does that mean, and how can folks think about this?
Sure. And by the way, I'm very happy that we're not talking about the HR 1.1, 1.2, because even as the person who wrote them, I sometimes forget. I kind of feel like, wait, what was the number again? So indeed, we're going to talk about the 4 so-called requirements. And the first one is to make a commitment to human rights. Now, this is roughly split into 2, where there's a sub-requirement for smaller companies and there's a sub-requirement for larger companies. The smaller one is pure and simple, just a commitment. I believe in human rights and I commit to certain standards and frameworks, and they're specified in the standard. And that really is meant to be a light version for smaller companies, whereas the other requirement for larger companies is about having a human rights policy, which includes a commitment. Now, to be very frank with you, Ryan, we ummed and awed about this a lot because a policy on its own doesn't necessarily equate to impact, right? So there was part of me that was thinking, like, should we have this, having a policy? But at the end of the day, there's 2 important things. One is a policy, if done well, of course, can be impactful and it's tangible. So it makes sense to put it in there as something that's concrete and verifiable. And the other side of it is actually a lot of other standards require this. And so if we suddenly didn't require a human rights policy, there would be this big gap between us and other frameworks and standards. So we thought, you know what, let's just put it in there and try to have guardrails so that companies hopefully create a very good, strong human rights policy. And then, of course, if done well, that will support all of their human rights work and will connect with all of the work related to the other requirements.
Right. So by itself, if I write a policy that says, I commit to respecting human rights, it doesn't do anything necessarily, right? So that's just, it's the sort of table stakes to get in the door of this first requirement.
So indeed, having a good policy makes all the difference. And so we put a lot of energy into trying to define not just what good looks like, but the theory is have a good process and create guardrails around that, create concrete criteria around what is required for a good process in the hope that a good process leads to a good quality policy. So there's a lot of references to stakeholder engagement, for example, or what needs to be included in the policy. So that's like our theory of change for hopefully having B Corps create good quality human rights policies.
Just for folks who are listening, the policy would need to commit to respecting human rights, assessing the company's potential negative human rights impacts, remediating the negative impacts the company has caused or contributed to, be approved by the highest governing body. And so we'll get into some of that next, I think, with this identifying salient human rights. So let's say you're a company who's like, great, I'm fine having a policy. We commit to, respecting human rights across our different stakeholders. So then the next level is identifying the salient human rights issues and developing a strategy. So what are salient human rights issues? How would you even think about a strategy, blah, blah, blah. Maybe you could even give us an example for a services company and maybe a product company, just so there's maybe some differences there.
Sure. And let's start with some jargon busting. This salient, right? It's funny because it's not a word that I think appears easily in other contexts. Salient just means material. Now, in the business and human rights space, there's a bit of an allergic reaction to the word material because for a lot of people, material means financially material. And so historically, the business and human rights space is like, let's use the word salient to avoid any confusion. But in our standard, we do use the word material, impact materiality, right? In ESC, environmental stewardship and circularity, the word material is used, PSG as well. So for the sake of simplicity, we can just say saliency means material. And in short, it just means the most relevant human rights issues for a company. So this is where we already get to the beauty of human rights due diligence. I never thought I would say this. I had a bit of an aversion to the word human rights due diligence because it sounds a little bit boring, doesn't it? It sounds like it might put people off. But I've really learned to love the term because it actually does something really well, which is it's a bit of like a cheat code for a company, right? So if we say to a company, you have to be mindful of all your impacts on people. That's what human rights is about. That feels overwhelming. So how does a company do that? Well, what human rights due diligence says is, okay, you need to focus your energy on the areas that matter most. What are the areas that matter most? Well, where the risks are the biggest. And those are your salient issues. They're the ones that are most relevant for your company to address. Now, an important point here is that we are focusing on negative impacts, not positive impacts. So what are the ways your company is most likely harming people? That's a different way to put it. And as we mentioned before, there are different spheres where this can happen. It's your own employees, the supply chain, consumers, can also be community members. So maybe the manufacturing company has a factory and there are hazardous materials being emitted into the water, that could be having a human rights impact on the community, right? So even though that community is not part of the supply chain, a company has to be mindful of those impacts as well. So what a company does is they basically do an assessment, a so-called saliency assessment, where they try to figure out where are the biggest impacts, and they have to look at severity as well as likelihood. And that gives them a list of usually between 5 and 10 salient issues. And this is where the cheat code comes in, is like, this is a framework so that they know where they can focus their energy and their resources on. So actually, a lot about respecting human rights and human rights due diligence is about efficiency and focusing on the areas that matter most. I gave you one example, which is the community members surrounding a factory. Another example could be a service company. Well, actually, the example before I think is great. It's not quite services, but social media, of course, we know has huge impacts on their consumers. So I would expect any social media company in their saliency assessment, if they don't have mental health impacts on young people as one of the salient issues, that for me is a red flag to be like, have they done their assessment properly? Then, of course, if we look at things like companies that sell alcohol, then, of course, the health impacts on consumers is also relevant and also something that I would be looking for, whether that's listed as one of their salient issues. And generally, particularly for larger companies with larger workforces, I would expect to see maybe 1 or 2 salient issues related to their own workforce, particularly if they have a large, diverse workforce, maybe operations in different countries. What's quite common is, for example, gender discrimination. That tends to pop up because, let's be honest, gender discrimination is a global issue. Discrimination of all kinds is. So those are some examples of salient issues that I would expect to see for different kinds of companies. But it's important to note, it's highly context specific. And there are many lists out there to say, if you sell chocolate, these are the risks in the cocoa supply chain. But the truth is, salient issues, the ones that are most relevant, are so specific to each company. That's why it's important. And that's why we have requirements for companies to do that self-assessment as an important cornerstone for a lot of the other human rights requirements.
Yeah. I'm noticing some overlap with what's required in the stakeholder mapping in PS and the purpose of stakeholder governance. Because when you said do a likelihood of something happening and severity, some of my clients, because I'm working through with some smaller and larger companies on the new standards, we haven't even got to the human rights section, but we've already been doing, it is, I guess, maybe more materiality in the purpose and stakeholder governance section. But it's like, okay, well, of all the things that could negatively or positively affect our, I guess maybe in human rights, it'd be more on a risk side, on a negative side, but we've already done some mapping. And so I'm wondering if that could be helpful for B Corps to know that some of the work that they've already done potentially in the stakeholder mapping can also work for the human rights. Is that true?
Absolutely. So I think there's a few things that we can give as tips to the audience. So one is indeed, whatever is done under purpose and stakeholder governance absolutely feeds into both human rights and environmental stewardship and circularity in terms of like sequencing, right? So I've done this work and that feeds into that. But another tip is for smaller companies and particularly simple companies, and by simple, I mean, maybe they only sell one kind of product or they have very short and homogeneous supply chains. They're not sourcing lots of different materials. So an example, like a mobile phone is very complex because there's lots of different materials. But if a company is selling, what's a good example? I don't know, fruit, and there's just one supplier from one country, that can be a fairly simple supply chain and simple operations because they're only selling one kind of product. What they could do is they could merge all of these assessments into one. So they can do their assessment under PSG, their materiality assessment, merge it with the environmental assessment, and merge it with the human rights assessment. So do it all in one go as one process. Now, of course, the outputs are a little bit different. Maybe they lead to different kinds of documents, but certainly in terms of a process, how it's run, it absolutely can make sense to run it together. And this leads to another tip, which is generally speaking, there are a lot of ways in which human rights and ESG, readers who have looked closely and have looked at both impact topics will see actually there are, in many cases, like copy paste the exact same sub-requirement across the two. And in those cases, the processes can always be run together. There's nothing that prohibits companies from doing that.
I'll ask you a tough question here. Is Coca-Cola probably has a human rights assessment done, right? Or ExxonMobil, or I think you had even joked that there's more tobacco companies with human rights assessments completed.
Yeah, it was. When I counted like 2 years ago, there were more tobacco companies with human rights policies than B Corps with human rights policies. Yeah.
And so I guess if I were to be the sort of more skeptical devil's advocate, I'd say, let's say a B Corp does this, they do a great assessment, they map everything out, and then they say, great, we've done this, check the box, we've met this requirement from B Lab, but at the end of the day, they're still maybe Coca-Cola, or they're still doing something that's not beneficial to society and the environment. This is more of like a philosophical question, but how do you balance that in the development of the standards of like, yes, we want companies to do X, Y, Z and have this thing. And it sort of maybe touches on what I've been trying to talk about, it's like embodiment, but how do you like live it or like sort of embody the thing rather than just say we've done our assessment? I don't know. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. I mean, this is obviously one of the hardest part of writing standards, right? Is you want, ideally, everything is impact based, right? And you can measure everything and everything is focused on, in terms of like an action leads to a positive outcome and you can measure that. And ideally, everything you put in the standard always leads to that positive outcome. The truth is it's way too complex. It's way too complex because, simply put, that's not how impact works. All of us working in the impact space know that. Also, if we look at the B Corp community, it's so incredibly diverse. All sizes, pretty much all sectors and all over the world, right? So what often happens is what good looks like also tends to vary. And so sometimes you have to go to like a common denominator, and something like a human rights policy is such a common denominator, right? In pretty much any place around the world, any kind of company can create or commit to human rights. There's a few exceptions in some countries, of course, but generally speaking, that's a possibility. So in the standards work, it's a matter of trying to find those tangible, universal things that we can require, and then in certain areas going a little bit further, pushing further in the areas that really matter. What I'll also add is we've been very deliberate about kind of a building block approach within the standards. So to flip the logic, right? If we said, okay, version 2 is all about mandatory requirements, then we say, what are the requirements that we need? Well, because our community is so diverse, it's impossible for B Lab always to specify what might be required. And so then the question is, what are the areas you want to focus on? But then B Lab can't define that for all companies. So then you hand it over to companies, say, okay, you figure out what are the areas to focus on. That's where materiality and saliency comes in, because that really is the only way to do it. And indeed, it could be that a company kind of cuts corners and doesn't do it properly and comes up with a saliency assessment that isn't good quality. And that would be a shame. We've tried to create guardrails so that, again, a little bit like with the policy, we hope a good quality assessment process will lead to a good quality assessment. And then where the building blocks come in is we have other requirements that build on that assessment. So we're going to get to in a second when we talk about the supply chain, but one of the requirements is work with your suppliers on your salient issues. So there's a connection with quite a few requirements linking back to the salient issues. And we also have, without wanting to make it too complex, we can talk about this a little bit in more detail if needed. We have under FR3 the risk tool, which asks questions to companies about risky practices. So one of the questions, for example, is, does your company sell anything that harms consumer health? Selling sugary products is a clear example of that. They would need to consider health impacts on consumers as part of the saliency assessment. So that's an example of one of those guardrails I was talking about where, if Coca-Cola, that's a perfect example, Coca-Cola filled out the FR3 risk assessment, they would have to answer yes because of selling a sugary product. If they completely ignored health impacts on consumers in their saliency assessment, they would actually get a non-compliance. Now, it doesn't guarantee that their assessment would be perfect or would necessarily be high quality, but there are certain guardrails in place to try to make companies do it as well as we want them to do it.
Brilliant. Why don't we take Lyft economy as an example that we could just brainstorm a little bit for this salient human rights issues and develop a strategy, just because I feel like a lot of product companies, I wouldn't say it's straightforward, but it's like, yes, we know if we're a coffee company, we sure as hell better know what's going on in our supply chain, right? But if you're a service company like Lyft or others, it may feel like human rights, this is the first time we're being asked to think about human rights. So if you were consulting with Lyft and you said, okay, as a service company, to identify your salient human rights issues and think about a strategy, what would you advise us? Could we work through a little bit live how that might work?
Yeah, absolutely. Immediately in my mind, there's already a few hotspots that I can think of, right? So one is clients. What kind of clients does the company have? So in human rights terms, this would be called contributing. So maybe if working with oil and gas, right, then the company would be contributing to the client's impacts. It depends, of course, what the nature of the service is. But absolutely, there's an element of contributing potentially to whatever the client does, right? So that's why under human rights, there is a requirement focusing on what you could call client screening. We don't use those terms in the standards, but that is essentially what it's about, is when making decisions about potential clients, crucially potential, because this needs to be thought of before entering into agreements, think about what are the potential impacts that I might be contributing to. So oil and gas is a clear example, tobacco as well, but there's also many
Would
other
that make us
of
ineligible if we had more than 1% of revenue that would even come from oil and gas, say, for example?
It depends on the nature of the service. So what you're alluding to is the foundation requirements. Indeed, it depends on the nature of the service, could make a company ineligible. But there's, of course, a lot of other industries. So what I think the standard tries to do better, version 2 versus the old standard, is be very clear and explicit about what's not allowed and what is allowed. What that means is there's a very clear and actually short list of what's not allowed. there may be ways in which a company like yours will be working with clients that are not necessarily in the list in the standards, right? Because let's be honest, there's lots of controversial industries not necessarily captured explicitly in foundation requirements. So crypto could be an example, right? Crypto is not necessarily listed like tobacco is, but your company might be working with a crypto client. A lot of crypto stuff out there is an outright scam. So it would be a case of trying to assess both the company as well as the project to understand what might I be contributing to. So that's the client screening side. Other areas to look at are procurement. So maybe you have an office and you're buying a lot of coffee to make sure that everyone's well caffeinated in the office. Well, those are also impacts you're having through your procurement. And so in the human rights topic, we do also have requirements around procurement. And this is more for smaller companies, also for service companies, to be mindful of the purchases being made. And we're talking about really everyday purchases here, right? Coffee or with laptops, that's a good one, right? Because there's a lot of conflict minerals used in our technology. So is the company thinking proactively about what technological devices are being purchased, which ones have more or less of an impact on people in those technology supply chains?
To take a brief sidetrack here, the foundation requirements were changed away from this like causing, contributing to, linked language, and are now like the 5 sectors that are sort of explicitly not allowed. And there was things that I think were in that initial, I think prisons were initially said, but I think are not in the final 5 currently. Like, can you just briefly say, was the goal or like the change in the foundation requirements, was that just because the cause, contributing to, linked was just feeling unworkable for a lot of companies, like as companies were starting to do it? Was that the reason it shifted?
Yeah. I think that's a pretty fair way to put it. Maybe a slightly nicer way to put it is about clarity, right? It wasn't clear to everyone. It was an interesting process because the cause and contribute language is language already used in the business and human rights space. So there was an attempt to try to align with existing terminology being used. But what was clear is a lot of companies still found it confusing, maybe actually weren't used to those terms from the other space. So for them, it was just new and confusing. So yeah, it was driven mostly by a desire to make it clearer. Because that's, let's be honest, if we look at everything around eligibility, that has historically been a challenge, right? Companies finding out late in the process, oh, you have that kind of client, you're doing this, okay, then you're ineligible. Or filling out the disclosure questionnaire where companies are filling it out, but it's not clear what the consequences are, right? If I answer yes to this, what's going to happen? And so a lot of the work and energy put into foundation requirements was to solve for that, was to upfront in the very beginning of the process, have all of this content exist and be very explicit and clear about what the consequences are. So I hope that B Corps and companies do feel like it's clearer than it was before. It wasn't easy to create. Hopefully you can have Grace on to do an episode on the foundation requirements.
Yeah, I forgot Grace handled that one too. Well, maybe before we jump into this third major section, there is one thing that I think is becoming more influential and impactful that you all put into the standards that I don't think before I started working with companies, I realized how important it was. It's almost on every standard, which is it has to be approved by the highest governing body, and it has to be approved by the board, depending on your size, highest governing body, board, executive, depending on who it is. That actually, to my earlier question around Coca-Cola and, whether they believe in this, in the version 1.6 standards for B Corp, you could have a human rights policy that is not actually governed by the highest governing body. But in this new version, you do have to have this all approved by the highest governing body. And I'm assuming that SCS Global and TwoCert, the sort of third-party companies who are doing the assurance process, are going to be asking the board and the CEO if they know these things. So I do want to say that this whole idea of, we can't force companies to act, but if you're forcing the board to talk about it and consider it and sign off on it, that actually is pretty meaningful because it creates the conversation in the room where things can change. And so I don't know if you want to say anything more about that. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. And actually, whilst at B Lab, this is one of the areas we received a lot of positive feedback on. Is there is a very clear increase in expectation here. It's also a perfect example of what I mentioned before, these guardrails, right? So having a good quality process and having those guardrails will lead to good outcomes. Having senior leadership buy-in is absolutely one of those ways to increase the chance of good quality outcome. And we've been quite deliberate. I think in version 2 or draft 2, we probably had a little bit too much of that. We got some feedback to say, hey guys, this is a little bit too much. Can we tone it down a little bit? And we've been a little bit more flexible, saying either the highest governing body, which might be a board, or the what we call executive team, which could be C-suite or directors, to allow a little bit more flexibility for companies to do what makes sense for their context. And maybe in the way that I'm describing it, I'm kind of underselling it a little bit, just because that's in my nature. Because I don't want to, particularly with new standards, I don't want to oversell or overclaim. But yeah, if we look at what is really cool about version 2, I think this is part of it. And another part of it is actually all the stakeholder engagement. Obviously, there's purpose and stakeholder governance, which is its own topic. But I once counted, and stakeholder appears like 550, maybe even 600 times across the standard. It appears way more than, for example, data or policy. And I think that's one thing that we've done well is integrate that stakeholder engagement throughout the standards.
Yeah.
Has that stood out to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the companies I'm working with as part of the stakeholder mapping, it's like, well, you can't just have your, this is for an extra large company. It's like, you can't just have your sustainability team just guess like, oh yeah, this stakeholder thinks that. It's like, no, do a survey, like reach out to your stakeholders there and like get a subset of your stakeholders who are employees and get their feedback, and then customers and then suppliers. So it's a pain in the ass to do all that for these companies. They're kind of like, oh my God, B Lab is serious. But I have also been selling that it's actually really valuable data. If you ask your customers, like, hey, we've identified these 8 to 10 issues that we think are our biggest potential negative or like potential impacts, like carbon emissions or human rights or sort of like fair labor. And you say, can you rank which ones you think are most important and give us feedback? Then they give us feedback, and then our employees. So you get this really interesting, useful data set of all these different stakeholders and how they see the company, which can then inform product development or marketing or a lot of things. So I see it as all being, again, like it's more of a pain than version 1.6, because in the past you could just write a policy, put it on your shared internal drive and say it's done, right? But then this is like, oh no, we have to show the feedback from the staff, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an important part of stakeholder governance, which is an important part of being a B Corp. What I'll add as a little tip though is, whilst writing, we have been very deliberate about what kind of stakeholder engagement might be needed. What I have noticed is companies sometimes think, oh, I need to ask everyone about everything, which is not the case. So we've been deliberate about internal versus external stakeholders. Or for example, it might say, speak to your stakeholders or do research. So there is some devil in the detail. And I think companies that are feeling overwhelmed by this can benefit from reading the detail and really understanding, okay, this is what's actually required.
Well, let's turn to this third overarching section, to sort of preventing, mitigating, and remediating negative human rights impacts. So I think this does depend on the size of your company and industry to the extent that you would need to actually remediate. Well, maybe you could speak to that. So what is this broad standard really looking at, and how should companies think about this?
Let's start with some jargon busting again. So there is a difference between preventing and mitigating. And there's this nice example I can use from my own audit days is I went to a coffee decaffeination plant, and they had really, really loud machines. So loud that workers using them would get hearing damage. So an example of mitigating that negative impact would be giving the workers ear protectors, right? Because that reduces the chance that they get hearing damage. It also would reduce the severity if they were to get hearing damage. That's mitigating a negative impact. Preventing that impact would be buying a new machine that doesn't make any loud noise, or having robots instead of people, right? That prevents the impact from happening. In the human rights space, it's important to understand the difference, because there is essentially this hierarchy of how companies should go about this. Companies should start by trying to prevent impacts, negative impacts from happening. Then if they can, they should try to mitigate them, which means, reduce the likelihood or reduce the impact that it's going to have, the severity. And then lastly, if unfortunately the impact does happen, then they remediate, which basically means to correct or to compensate for that impact. In the case of hearing damage, it might be, sending this person to the doctor, paying for the medical bills, and finding a way to solve for this in the future. So all three terms are important, and that's why they're all captured in the line that you just read. And this is where a lot of the action happens. So we spoke about having a policy, doing an assessment. This is where a lot of the expectations start to kick in, is basically you now are committed and you understand where your big risks are. Now do something about them. That's basically in layman's term what this is about. And they will, companies will have to be aware of incoming signals. Okay, this civil society organization is accusing me of having certain negative impacts on my customers. Okay, I received this information. What am I going to do with the information? I'm going to take it seriously. And maybe, I have certain processes and policies in place to get moving so that I'm not kind of on my back foot when this information comes in. One of the sub-requirements I get the most, or I used to get the most questions on, was the first sub-requirement in this subtopic area. And it's about having a process to deal with escalation. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you, but it's about essentially having a process to escalate and respond to certain incoming signals. Now, the reason this is important is because due diligence is all about being proactive and being ready to address those incoming signals, right? And again, it could be stakeholder information, could also be the company finding out about something, could be a whistleblower, right? And it's about having certain processes in place to be ready to go, and also having essentially that commitment to say, okay, if we get a signal, we are going to do X, Y, and Z. To make it more tangible, the example I always give is in the food industry, companies are pretty well set up to deal with food safety issues, right? So let's say a company is making chewing gum, and then they will regularly test, right? And if suddenly they find E. coli or some kind of bacteria in the chewing gum, they have protocols to follow. They will take a batch off the line. They'll maybe even incinerate it. Maybe they will recall a product from the supermarket. What we essentially want to see is that kind of organization, that proactivity, that dedication when it comes to all kinds of human rights impact, not just these kinds of consumer safety impacts.
And so for a company, again, like using Lyft economy, I think we would probably look at clients, right? And, procurement. And so, for example, if for some reason we got 90% of our procurement from, Amazon, which we don't, but, let's say we did, and then we would have to say, potentially in a human rights assessment, well, Amazon has been accused of overworking workers and making people wear diapers when they're delivery trucks or drivers because they don't have time to go to the restroom, et cetera. And so it's not so much like, again, we would have to drop Amazon, which would be B Lab requiring certain actions. It's more to say, can you prevent, mitigate or remediate? So preventing obviously would be like, maybe don't use Amazon. Mitigating might be, some sort of participating in collective action to help Amazon workers unionize or something. Remediate is, maybe donating to a fund. But I imagine, I'm just trying to work through how a services company, am I on the right track, do you think, for this?
So when it comes to procurement, we package that in the one that we're going to discuss later, which is about suppliers and procurement.
Fair enough.
But I think you're thinking about it in the right way, which is, what are the business decisions that I'm making and how might that be impacting people negatively? And then doing something about it. We spoke earlier about client screening. So that appears in this bucket. So for service companies, that's one to really look closely at. So this is for all service with a minor footprint companies, essentially all those with organizational clients, as we put it. There's a specific list. So it would, management consulting, law firms, all those kinds of services that tend to work with organizational clients. So not individual clients, but organizational ones. They're expected to do client screening because we're recognizing that for service companies, some of the biggest impacts are through the clients. So that's a very concrete requirement. And we specify exactly how companies need to do that. They need to assess their most material potential clients. And then there's a little bit of flexibility on how material is defined, can be cost, can be impacts, can be a few different things. So I think that's the one that I would call out. Then there's a different group, which is, for example, equity investing. So also a type of service, of course. They have to do something similar, but for their investments. So investment screening in simple terms. Similarly, when they make decisions or before they make decisions about where they invest, they have to screen those investments for human rights and also environmental potential impacts, and then consider those when making decisions.
Right. Okay. So for Lyft, so for organizational clients, it's like, let's say we had a pharmaceutical company where it's not in this clear like weapons or tobacco profile. Maybe it's pharmaceuticals and we don't provide this, but imagine it's marketing services or something. So it'd be, okay, so this pharmaceutical company, it's maybe 30% of our revenue. So we have to really make sure that what are the drugs that they're putting out? What is their record on certain things? How are they engaging in local communities, et cetera? And so if this client is, let's say they're putting out drugs that are helpful for folks, but charging 100x the price, which often happens in pharmaceuticals, maybe some sort of way to work with them is, hey, we've got to help you, fix this like price gouging component. Or I can imagine some creativity that B Corps would come up with if they had to do a sort of human rights assessment on some of their large clients. Am I on the right track from this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's, having just started as an independent consultant, I know what it's like when you're trying to find work, and I don't want to be too blasé about it and say, oh, companies can easily turn down clients. I know it's a competitive environment and service companies with clients need that incoming business. But what we do want to see is companies to be really actively thinking and to be cognizant, to be mindful of the ways in which they might be contributing through their clients to negative impacts. I mean, what we want to avoid at all costs is service companies taking on clients without thinking about any of this at all. I like to think, your company and other companies already in the B Corp community already do this to some extent, but I don't know if that's true. There might be companies that really do just take on any client, or maybe they do look at certain criteria, but maybe they're a little bit naive about potential impacts through their clients. They haven't really invested the energy that they should. Or maybe it's different people involved. Maybe it's someone very senior making decisions, and there's a very dedicated sustainability team that's thinking, let's not take on this client. But at the top level, they're like, you know what, it's good for business, it's good for the bottom line, let's just do it. So what we want to see is the entire company and all the right people geared towards really thinking through, okay, what is this client all about? What is our role in the project? What negative impacts might we be contributing to? And maybe that involves having a discussion with the client saying, look, I care about X, Y, and Z. We're worried about this. How do you feel about this? And in the ideal scenario, also, it's a joint exercise. I know, service companies are competing and don't always have leverage, but certainly where that is that possibility, I think that's a very good practice to have. And that alludes to the mitigation you're talking about, right? Okay, I'm going to take on the client, but I see that they do this. You talked about pharmaceuticals, right? So maybe if it's about marketing, asking questions about, okay, but what's the drug that I'm going to help you market? What impacts? And you could also ask, like, what feedback have you received about this drug? Do you have any concerns? How can we together mitigate this? And mitigation can take many different forms, right? It could be, for example, adjusting the marketing. So maybe not targeting the marketing towards young people, only focusing on another segment of the population, or only focusing on certain countries and not other countries, or changing the messaging. There's lots of different ways in which mitigation can work. So we're not saying, you're not allowed to have those clients. That's important. I think that's a common misconception. But we are saying have a good, robust process in place and have good faith, sincere reflection before taking on these projects or clients.
Well, let's shift to this last one here, which is work with suppliers to achieve human rights objectives. Again, there's the broader framing is its focus on the supply chain. What would you say about that? Maybe anything else that you would maybe add to my sort of Amazon example or anything else that folks should know about this topic?
This is what I find one of the most exciting areas of the standards, because I mentioned before, I think past versions have been weak on the supply chain. I think, it's not for a bad reason. I think the focus is so much on the company that the supply chain maybe felt secondary. But I think, as we all know, a lot of the bad stuff does happen in supply chain. So for us, it was a big priority to address in version 2. And that's where it appears in this bucket. And there's really a lot there. So for smaller companies and for service companies, there's a focus on procurement. So we spoke before about your company buying coffee. What kind of coffee are you buying? Are you going to buy fair trade certified coffee? When you buy laptops, how are you looking at potential impacts? Then for companies with, let's say, a more traditional supply chain, so in manufacturing or in retail, they need to start looking at their relationship with their suppliers and start tackling the biggest issues. By biggest issues, I mean their salient issues. So to use a concrete example, let's say there is a company that makes chocolate bars. Well, we all know that child labor in the cocoa sector is a massive risk. So I would expect for a company that makes chocolate, I would expect child labor or forced labor to be one of their salient issues. And then there's another requirement that says, okay, you have to work on your salient issues with your suppliers. So then I would see, okay, with your suppliers, how are you working on these salient issues? As we all know, supply chains can be long and complex, and companies often don't have visibility. What's key is we are not saying companies need full visibility or full traceability. What we are saying, though, is they need to work with their suppliers on these areas. And there's a good degree of trying to get companies to start the process. This is a good example of progress over perfection. I think is that the expression?
Yep.
Yeah, right. So get started, talk to your suppliers, focus on those salient issues, see what you can do, come up with mitigation issues, and crucially work together. And I think a big part of what I've tried to integrate in the human rights topic as well is be honest and sincere about a lot of this work. One of the most frustrating things I see with companies is, okay, we're going to launch a new product. Where can we get this ingredient cheapest? Okay, China. Great. Let's source this from China. Which is the supplier that can do it cheapest? Okay, this one. And then later, the sustainability team is kind of expected to clean things up or to make up for the fact that it is really hard to verify good working conditions in Chinese factories. And so when I talk about being sincere and self-reflecting, is actually doing this before the decisions are made, being honest and saying, okay, we need a new product, we need a new ingredient, we need a supplier. Should we go to China or should we go to another country? What are the pros and cons? What are the trade-offs? So we know with China, verifying working conditions is very, very challenging. Okay, what about a country like Vietnam? Or what about a country like India? What are our options there? And to really weigh up all that together. And a lot of that is about what the business can do to set themselves up for success so that it's not only a case of working with really difficult suppliers, trying to really tackle harsh, tricky, severe issues with suppliers that often don't want to collaborate. So it's about kind of flipping the sequence, being more proactive, making a lot of the good decisions early on. I'll give you an example that I really like. There's a Dutch clothing brand called Mr. Marvis. They're known for making shorts. Their clothing manufacturers are all based in Portugal. And one of the reasons they do this is for simplicity, but also because the risks are much lower in a Portuguese factory than in a far Asian factory. And it's not to say that Portuguese or European is better than Asian, but it's really about proximity and ability to have a good relationship with suppliers and crucially have some degree of visibility and verify what's happening. It is really hard to verify good working conditions in Chinese factories nowadays. And so that's, I think, a good example of making good decisions early on so that you can essentially set yourself up for success.
And I did want to call out that if you're a small micro company without workers, even some medium, the main requirement for you is considering actual and potential human rights impacts in procurement decisions rather than doing this sort of more deeper or working with suppliers, I guess, is what Bernard was speaking to. Could you clarify that at all just for folks on terms of size?
Yeah. So, one of the tricky things we found is a lot of companies don't necessarily have suppliers because a supplier means like a fixed relationship. If I'm selling t-shirts, or let's say I'm printing t-shirts and selling them, my supplier sends me t-shirts based on a contract that I have, X number of t-shirts per year or whatever. But if we scale that down and we talk about, let's say, a two-person business that's printing t-shirts, they don't have a supplier giving them X number of t-shirts. They're probably going online and just buying t-shirts from a retailer and then doing the printing on top, right? And so that online platform is not really a supplier because they're just procuring it. So that's why we make this distinction, is recognizing that in more traditional supply chains for larger companies, there is that long-term business relationship. And that is then the focus, to improve relationship through that engagement. But then for smaller companies and other kinds of companies with less of a traditional supply chain, the focus is more on the procurement decisions.
One thing that's overarching all of this stuff for me is there's an interview I did that I released in the previous episode with Eric Ries, who wrote The Lean Startup. And he just released a new book called Incorruptible. And it's about how do you create the conditions where your company has a mission lock structure similar to Tony's Chocolonely with, I believe they have it's like a trust that owns the sort of purpose, similar to Patagonia. IKEA has it, Novo Nordisk, Costco has a version of it, but it creates this protection for companies to even have the spaciousness to consider a lot of these things. I think a lot of companies, the human rights topics and some of these topics we're addressing in the new standards are derivatives of companies that have to feel like they're maximizing shareholder value and like being extractive because of the pressure of and expectations of capital and sort of the way that laws are set up, privileging shareholders, et cetera. And so I would just encourage folks also to check out this book, Incorruptible by Eric Ries. And, there's a lot of work going on in Europe, like Purpose Foundation and others who are looking at how do we actually create the governance structure that then gives us more of the spaciousness to consider human rights impact topics and things like that. I'm not sure if you want to say anything on that, Bernard.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think we spoke a lot about the power of human rights due diligence and these frameworks. But I think it's fair to say there's also limitations, right? It is very focused on minimizing negative impacts, completely silent on the pursuit of positive impacts, also completely silent on profit. From a human rights due diligence perspective, a company can make and extract as much profit as they want, as long as they are actively trying to minimize their negative impacts. So I do think it's good that you call that out, both in the context of human rights and our standards more broadly. There are some things they do very well, but there's some things that are not covered.
Yeah. I'm curious, now that we've been through these 4 topics and talked quite a bit about human rights, what else are we missing? What other things should the listeners know? And then maybe a second part of this is, if you're overwhelmed by the human rights topic or something, could you give some folks any encouragement of what are a couple small wins they could do to move this forward in their companies?
So we spoke a little bit about the fact that a lot of this work is about prioritization and efficiency. And that's, I think, a key message I want to pass along, particularly for any listeners who maybe are in the sustainability team and maybe they're struggling to convince senior leadership to do this. Well, use terms like efficiency, focus, we're very targeted, dedicating resources to the areas that matter most. I think that helps land the message and maybe gets leadership on board, because these things are important, right? And we haven't spoken at all about the reputational costs of human rights violations, because from my perhaps somewhat idealistic mindset, that shouldn't be a driver, but it is actually a driver for a lot of companies. So I think that's also worth considering and could be part of the messaging people give to senior leadership is, right, let's invest in all these things. Let's do what the standards say, because it'll help us manage and prevent issues from happening. And that's great for the people that might otherwise be affected. It's also great for us as a company because the chance of reputational damage is decreased. What I'll also add is, from a regulatory perspective, there's a lot of efficiency gains as well. So a lot of jurisdictions are setting up forced labor bans. The US famously already has one. The Customs and Border Protection has had for several years now mechanisms to prevent goods coming into the country that they suspect are made with forced labor. Well, how do you prove otherwise? A lot of it is actually human rights due diligence. What processes do you have in place to monitor what your suppliers are doing? Canada has this as well now, and Europe is in the process of setting it up. So this is only about forced labor import bans, and there's a lot of other regulation happening as well. So in the EU, there's of course CSRD and ESRS, so the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directives. They're of course all about due diligence, and there's a lot of commonality between what's required in human rights and what's required in that regulation. And what I'll add is, because I think oftentimes there's this misunderstanding that a lot of due diligence work is European. It's not. We're now seeing a lot of EU regulation coming through. But certainly if we look historically and we look towards the future, this kind of regulation is emerging in all kinds of places. So Brazil and Japan are also working, or were working on a due diligence legislation. So it is a global movement. It originates from the United Nations. It was voted on and it was agreed on unanimously. The process to come up with the UN Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights was led by an American, John Ruggie. So it's certainly, I don't see it as an EU movement or an EU initiative, even though I can understand it to some stakeholders, it feels that way. I certainly see it as a global movement, and that should help companies with compliance, but also just keeping in step with what good looks like within the B Corp community, but also crucially outside.
Rarely heard a positive thing said about U.S. Customs and Border Patrols. That's interesting.
I can imagine.
Maybe in the last few questions here, was there anything that you wanted to include in the standards that didn't sort of make the cut on the human rights side? Or anything that got too much pushback in the consultations?
I'll give you an example of something that I wish we could have beefed up more, and then I'll give you an example of something that we deliberately didn't put in. So something I wish we could have beefed up more is, if we look at the state of the world now, there's a lot of conflict happening, and we were cognizant of that, and we did create a sub-requirement focusing on what we call conflict-affected situations, or in layman's terms, conflict zones. But my goodness, it was so hard to create standards around this. To give you a few examples, even if we talk about conflict zone, there are different definitions, right? And there is where the violence is happening, but then there's the aggressor, not always the same thing. And you have illegal conflict and you have legal conflict. Sometimes there's a good reason to have conflict. But all of this is so opaque. It's one big gray area where it's really hard to draw lines around this is good, this is compliant, this is bad, this is non-compliant. The analogy I use with honestly mixed success is, in order to create standards, you need dry sand. You need to be able to draw a line in the sand and it needs to hold. When it comes to conflict, it's all dry sand. And you kind of try to draw a line and it just kind of, the sand collapses.
You mean it's all wet sand?
Sorry?
Right. Do you mean it's all wet sand, or like, because like the ocean will come in?
Yeah, I do need to say this right for the analogy to work, right? You need wet sand because otherwise the line doesn't hold.
Okay, got it. Yeah,
but it's all dry sand. That was it.
Got it.
So what we ended up creating is a requirement that has a lot of content to it. To be very honest, it doesn't have much teeth because a lot of it depends on self-assessment. It's basically saying, international companies, do you have operations in a country where there's conflict? Yes, no. You self-assess, are you having a negative impact on that conflict? Yes, no. If yes, then do X, Y, and Z. So there is a lot of trust that we're putting in the company's self-assessment. What we're hoping, though, is this is a good example of how there are different ways to affect change through a standard. Rather than mandating action here, what we're hoping will happen is there's a lot of guidance that hopefully will guide companies to do the right thing. So we're not naive. We tried our best to kind of mandate good practice because conflict is a horrific thing and we really want companies to be very mindful of their contribution to conflict. But it's so incredibly difficult to create standards around this, particularly global standards, universal standards for all sizes and sectors. So essentially we created something that could stand, could be verified, and tries to affect change by giving good guidance rather than mandating specific actions.
And one last question on this. Did you ever consider positive, like if you pay a living wage in your supply chain, you get positives? Why not include more positive stuff on the human rights side?
Well, there's two ways of answering this. From a human rights perspective, human rights is all about the bare minimum, right?
Right.
So inherently, it's about passing a certain bar. And paying a living wage is a good example where a living wage is a human right. But let's say profit sharing, it could be an example of a positive pursuit, but wouldn't really be about human rights because there's no right to sharing in profit. So that's beyond the living wage, right? Now, that's why it wouldn't be covered under human rights, because human rights is very much focused on reducing negative impacts. But then there's another question, which is why at the moment doesn't positive impact play a bigger role in the standards? And the main reason is that, of course, historically, positive impacts have been captured primarily through impact business models, and impact business models are not part of version 2. There's a few different reasons for that. One of the most concrete reasons is the impact business models were simply not compliant with EU regulation, right? Also, the way that they were crafted, they are kind of based on points, and the more it's part of the business model, the more points a company gets. But as we know, there are no points in the new standards. So they needed an overhaul. And simply put, they're so important that B-Lab needed more time to figure them out. So IBMs are being worked on and will eventually be introduced in one way or another. Maybe they'll be called something different, but that's going to be the main way in which positive impacts will regain a lot of its importance in the new standards.
So Bernard, you had mentioned also one thing you didn't include in the new standards. And what was that example?
Yeah, thanks for looping me back. So we had received public criticism from Dr. Bronner saying that they had advocated for all companies to use eco-social certifications in their supply chains. And that was feedback received very clearly. There's a very deliberate reason why we didn't do that. And that's because in simple terms, particularly in the social and the human rights domain, eco-social certifications aren't always great. In fact, there's a lot of evidence showing that social audits and social certification schemes are often very weak and can undermine a lot of good human rights work. We actually allude to a lot of this in the standard. So this is, I'm going to do one code for the people out there, if that's okay, HR 4.1, which has companies, if they are using social audits or social certification schemes, to actually be very critical of them. And that includes B Corp certification, because we're recognizing the limitations of social audits and social certifications. So to give you an example, we spoke a little bit about China earlier. It is really hard to verify good working conditions in China because there's a very booming audit industry, social compliance audit industry, but they have gotten so good at falsifying information, hiding the truth. There's also a lot of commercial pressure on audit companies to keep costs low, right? So companies want to commission audits, but they don't want to pay excessive amounts. So then the audit companies will say, okay, I'll spend X amount of time on site. Maybe they'll reduce the number of worker interviews. They'll basically push the costs down to make the client happy. But as we know, spending less time on site, less time speaking to workers undermines the value of an audit. And these limitations are so well documented, particularly in the social space. People who have been in this industry for a while will remember the Rana Plaza disaster in 2011, where it was a clothing factory in Bangladesh, audited from top to bottom by various social audit schemes, and the entire building collapsed. And it really highlights how social audits aren't very good at always capturing some of the worst stuff, particularly for things like forced labor as well. It's really not fit for purpose. So with all this in mind, we really didn't think it was appropriate to require all companies to have eco-social certifications for the supply chain. And we actually went the opposite direction and created a sub-requirement where rather than requiring it, we require companies to be critical of the social audits and sort of social certifications that they're using and to come up with mitigation actions. So a mitigation action might be, okay, I am going to source from, let's use another country as an example, Vietnam, but I do know that if I use certain audit companies that I'm not sure if the quality of the audit reports I'll get will be good. So maybe I'll work with an NGO or maybe I'll reach out to a local union to get other sources of information. So that's how we want to see companies be very honest about the limitations of social audits. And it's fine to continue using them. We're not saying they can't be used, but be honest about the limitations and find ways to address those gaps.
Yeah, and I think David's critique may have been there's certain eco-social certifications that I believe are credible, right? So he was probably saying you should use Fair for Life or like, his preferred vendors. But I think what you're saying is not necessarily that those preferred vendors would not be good, but it's just the whole broader one. It would be odd for B Lab to say like, here's 5 vendors, the only ones you can use, right? And then the broader thing around, well, if we require it, we can say maybe here's a couple, but also I lived in China for 6 months and traveled pretty extensively. And I think folks who have never been to developing countries don't realize like how different some of the business culture and like the audit structures and things like that. It's just really hard to, It's like, hey, we do a monthly audit. It's like, well, every month they might change how everything looks just for you to show up, and there's unannounced. There's always, I think the audits will make things better than if there was like no audits, right? So let's be clear. But also, I agree with your point about there's just a lot of variability with what you can truly say is happening or not with different companies.
Yeah, I think that's true. And of course, another aspect is the B Corp community is so incredibly diverse. And that means the supply chains that we created standards for are also incredibly diverse. And so whilst, maybe it's possible to say, okay, this kind of certification is generally good in the food sector, B Corp is so much more than just food. So that's another limitation why it's really hard to rely on existing certification schemes.
Yeah.
And there's another component, which is, of course, historically, B Lab has accepted, what we call equivalencies or mutual recognition, right? Okay, you have fair trade, you use fair trade in your supply chain, you will automatically get certain points. With the new EU rules, a lot of those equivalencies are unclear because arguably the auditor, and by the way, it would be the auditor that accepts it, not necessarily B Lab. That's at least kind of a working theory. The auditor might say, okay, well, I would only accept other standards and certifications that also comply with the EU legislation. I think that's a logical way to approach it. But this law is so new, we don't actually know which certification schemes are or are not compliant with EU legislation. So I think that's another reason why in version 2, there's no equivalencies. We can't, well, I should stop saying why B Lab can't rely on external certification schemes for the time being.
Well, Bernard, thank you so much for joining. In your new consulting work, is there anywhere folks can go to learn more about what you're doing or ways they can contact you if they want support on their work?
Thanks for asking. Probably the easiest thing to do is look me up on LinkedIn. So like all good independent consultants, I've been trying to add information there to attract potential clients. What I really want to do is work with companies to improve their impact, particularly the social impact. And that includes helping them meet the new B Lab standards. So if anyone is listening thinking, hey, I'd like to work together with Bernard, please do reach out and we can have an exploratory chat. I'll add, there are a lot of amazing consultants out there. One thing I've learned in the past 3 weeks of being an independent consultant is that there are both amazing companies and people doing this work. So I'm also trying to figure out what is my added value now. Of course, having written a good chunk of the standards, I think I do add kind of this unique perspective that I think a lot of consultants might not be able to add, but I absolutely don't want to make it seem like there aren't other good consultants out there.
Sure. Bernard, thanks again for joining. It's been a pleasure to have you, and I'm excited to have you on again for the Jedi topic.
Thanks so much for having me, Ryan.
Hey, Beyond the Bee listeners. If you're looking for even more inspiring conversations with leaders on the front lines of our movement towards just futures, be sure to subscribe to Next Economy Now, produced by the team at Lift Economy. Next Economy Now broadens the focus beyond the B Corp movement to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, equitable, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Check out our latest episodes at lifteconomy.com/podcast. You can subscribe to Next Economy Now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.